Hello, ngHouston. So we're super excited tonight because this has been a very popular topic. I have lots of panelists. So we have kind of an all-star panel. So this is going to be a really cool show. We have Mike and Brandon tonight talking about all the latest ngrx stuff. They were here with kind of an introductory probably about a year ago, and we invited them to come back because they're awesome. And we had so many people excited about this. So we have kind of a large panel tonight, and we've got a lot to cover, which is probably why I'm talking so fast, but it's going to be fun. Okay, so let's start with Ilya. Ilya, you were on the panel once before, and you were awesome. So you want to say hello? We know who you are, but say hello.
Okay. Well, hi, everyone. My name is Ilya. I'm from Bulgaria. What I basically do here is I have like a small company, and we do Angular with Node.js, of course. We love JavaScript. I also teach in Sofia University in advanced JavaScript course. And yeah, basically that's I also organize a couple of meetups here, and yeah, everything.
And Ilya's super cool. And Ilya, it's the middle of the night where you're at, so you get bonus points for that. So if you say something completely outlandish, you have like a built-in excuse because it's 2 o'clock in the morning.
It's not the first time that I stay so late. So I mean, basically, sometimes I work at this time, so it's pretty normal for me.
Well, we're glad to have you. And Justin, everybody knows Justin. Say hi, Justin.
Hi, Justin.
It's so backwards for me to have you on my show because I'm normally on your show, and so now it's like the tables are turned. Awesome.
Yeah, we're switching seats. I get to experience the panelist side.
Well, I know that NX is doing a lot of ngrx stuff and schematic stuff, so I was really hoping that we would have somebody from NX or from Narwhal, not NX, Narwhal, somebody from Narwhal representing tonight. So I'm glad you could make it.
Yeah, definitely. I'm an educator and project manager at Narwhal. I work over there, and we have NX, and we have a lot of buy-in for ngrx. So it's a topic that's pretty important to us, and we're excited about. So it's cool to be here.
Yeah,
it's really late here where I'm at too. That's like street lights. That's not the sun. Okay, it's the sun.
Yeah, you guys are hiring all the coolest people at Narwhal. Like all my favorite people are starting to be hired by Narwhal. So I feel like you guys are like taking over the world here. But it's cool because it's all like all the cool people.
Yeah, I think I heard them get called the Angular Avengers at one point on Twitter.
Yeah, I have suspicions. I think there's another announcement coming, but I'm not saying anything. But I suspect that I think they're going to keep on. I think they're just going to gobble up all the awesome people in the Angular community. So it'll be fun.
We're making a pod. We got a pod going.
Yeah,
so
yeah. Speaking of awesome people, Keith, you want to say hi?
Hi, how you doing? Been a little while since I've been on, I think.
I know, you've been busy. Well, you have a day job?
Yeah, something like that. I don't know. Something eating up my time. For those who don't know me, I'm Keith Stewart. I am the UI tech lead at CollabNet, an occasional panelist here and speaker at ngHouston sometimes. So. And
he's one of the original regulars on ngHouston from when way before we were on YouTube, and one of my favorite. So I'm glad you could join us. We missed you.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks. Lance Finney from Digital Oasis. I just love all the Digital Oasis guys. Or Oasis Digital, but I always say it backwards.
Yeah, I'm with Oasis Digital, St. Louis-based software consulting company. We also do a lot of training. You may know us from Angular Bootcamp. I'm one of the instructors there. We teach Angular JS and Angular now 5. So I've been using ngrx for about a year, and I'm excited to talk with the creators of it.
Me too. Me too. And Thomas. I have a special place in my heart for Thomas because Thomas is actually the one who taught me ngrx. And so he will always be a rock star to me. So if you guys are lucky, you've been doing some training with Thomas too, because he'll make you super smart. Thomas, you want to say hi?
Hi, everybody. And Bonnie, I didn't do anything. You'd put in all the effort, and it was your brains and your passion. Let's be honest. You know, I'm sort of in awe of you. You see me on tweet, like saying, giving my support.
So, well, you're awesome, and I'm glad you're here.
Hi, everybody. I'm Thomas Burleson. You may have known me when I was the team lead for AngularJS Material for almost 3 years, over 3 years. And then lately, I've been the architect for Angular Flex Layout. And I'm hoping that we'll have some interesting announcements along that front in Q1 and Q2 for some extra enhancements on that. And then there will be probably some other announcements that will come out in January that you'll hear about, but I'm not going to say this right now. So I'm passionate about Angular, and I'm passionate about great people like the panelists here. And so thank you, Bonnie.
And I'm just going to throw this out there for your consideration, Thomas. When you have new cool things to show us on Flexbox layout, you should come back and do another one, because you're actually, of all the sessions that we've ever done on ngHouston, yours has like more views than all the rest of them put together. So I don't know what magic you sprinkled in that episode, but
I did
want to
nothing.
come back. Well, you
I think Brandon
and,
and Mike are going to knock it out of the ballpark today. I think that's what's going to happen.
Right.
You know.
Well, we've set the bar pretty high for Mike and Brandon.
Oh, those guys are superstars.
So speaking of the star of the night, Mike and Brandon, you guys are amazing, and we love you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So you want to introduce yourselves? I mean, not that you need to, because everybody knows who you are, but you probably should anyway, just for, tradition.
Well, yeah, I'm Mike, and
I'm Brandon, and both of us we both work at a company called Synapse Wireless. We're senior software engineers, and we are both core contributors to the ngrx project.
Yeah, we created ngrx together 2.5, maybe 3 years ago at a different job. We actually have worked together at 2 different companies now.
Yeah.
And it's picked up a lot of steam in the past 6 months. It seems like it's a growing project. It's a community-led project, so it's me and Brandon, and then Rob Wormald is the founder of the organization. He works on the Angular team as a developer relations manager. And Victor Savikin from Narwhal.
We're very excited to have you. And do you want to share your screen? You have slides for, we have a lot of questions and comments, but I think you have a couple slides to share with us. So you want to start with that?
Definitely. So we'll do the screen share thing, see if I can wrangle this correctly. Okay. Can you see that okay?
We see it.
Perfect. So today, what Brandon and I want to talk about is reducing the boilerplate with ngrx. So for those who are not familiar with it, I think we've said this already, but it's a community project. And what we build is small reactive libraries for Angular. And we really focus mostly on state management, but really any web API that we feel like we can add a really high quality reactive surface around, that's what ngrx is about. And if you want to see our projects, you can go to github.com/ngrx. But the project that we're most known about is ngrx store. And we've been on here talking about store before, but a quick refresher is got actions and reducers and selectors and effects, and it's this whole mess, but really it's not that messy.
Right. So at a basic level, actions describe intent, or action describe what you want to do in your application. And you use those actions to describe state changes, which we pass to our reducers, and those reducers change our state and give us a new state each time if they choose to. And that state is used by components in your application. And if you've used ngrx before, you know that as your application grows, that amount of state that you need to maintain grows. And of course, ngrx store gives you a consistent way to handle that state throughout your app.
But don't let Brandon trick you with this slide, because it's not simple. This is a nice diagram, but it's really a different paradigm for building Angular applications. It really emphasizes functionality and reactivity throughout the code base. And so each of these really revolve around one thing, and that's actions. Brandon said they're like intent.
They're intent. So you can express many, if not most, all of the things in your applications through actions or through intents that you want to perform, because there are going to be many things that you want to do, like go make a network request or show a dialogue. But those things are actions that you want to express and that you can say throughout your app. So.
Right. And the way we describe these intents is we've got this common shape, if you will, of what an action looks like in your app. And really, it's just a plain JavaScript object that has a unique type, and we express that in a string. You can add anything else you want to this interface, but this is the core piece of ngrx.
Right, and this is also probably one of the things that it's going to be one of the things that you use the most. The interface is simple, but the amount of things that you can do with it, or the amount of things that people try to do with it, is enormous once you start using the pattern and get more comfortable with it.
And just to give you an example, the app that Brandon and I write on a daily basis, before this talk, I went and did just a quick grep to see how many of these things we have in our app. Granted, it's medium size, maybe about 7 engineers that work on it. I think we have over 900 unique action types declared in the project we work on. So you see these everywhere in an ngrx app. And so these are the core. Then stores about state change, and you do state changes with these special functions called reducers.
Right, and reducers, as the interface shows, take your existing state, the action that is passed to the reducer, and of course you have multiple reducers in your app to compose your application state, and they return a new state or the existing state if those reducers don't need to handle that particular action.
And so if we have that many actions, we probably have about a third as many reducers, maybe somewhere less.
Yeah, I think so.
And that's just, these capture global state, handle actions, make state changes. And again, it's one of these things that sounds simple on paper. I'll show you a reducer later in the talk. But yeah. And so reducers return state, and like I said, we have in the low hundreds of these. And so we have a lot of global state that's managed by our ngrx store in our application. And so the next common piece you see in an ngrx app is what's called a selector function. And what a selector function does is it's like, if you think of a store like a database.
Don't use strings. No, go ahead.
Then the selector is a function that queries the state and gives you some result. And so when you're getting up to speed with ngrx for the first time, one of the questions people have is, how do I get state out of it? The selector function is the way you get the piece of state you want in this large single object.
All right, and I was mainly joking about using the strings, but you can build selectors for the state using a string that will map those strings to the properties in the state, or you can use, like Mike said, selector functions. So it's options.
And then the last common fixture of an ngrx app you'll see a lot is effects. So one thing that I don't think Brandon and I have talked about yet is that an ngrx app, we really respect this concept of functional purity, which is a fancy way of saying that whenever our app talks to the outside world, we want to isolate that behavior and keep it as contained as possible from the rest of our application. And in doing so, the rest of our application, we can say, behaves consistently. If someone does something, then it always produces the same output with the exception of effects. So what ngrx effects allows you to do is it gives you tools to isolate those interactions with the outside world. Does that seem fair?
Yep.
Okay, so we just talked about 4 things, and we said that you see hundreds of these in a common Angular app, and boy, does that create boilerplate. I always fall back on this quote a lot, which is that Redux is not great for making simple things quickly. It's great for making really hard things simple. And I think at the core of this is that the word quickly, you can't really write ngrx quickly.
Right, and that also falls into the questions we get the most, or that we see the most is ngrx right for my app? And it just depends on the size of your app. There's no silver bullet to answer that question, but using ngrx, like I said, accomplishes the goal of the quote, and making those things simple will help you build a larger apps that it's made for.
So actions, reducers, selectors, effects, all these are boilerplate. And what we see a lot is that developers want to write an NGRX app with shortcuts, basically, how can I get around this boilerplate?
Right. So I'll mention real quick, just to drive this home, that if you're using NGRX, when you create features, these are the things that you're going to have to do to describe your state changes if you want to, because it allows you to do that in a consistent way. But it does, I think that's probably the other thing is the boilerplate aspect of it that people ask about the most.
And so actions are the thing that we write the most in NGRX apps. And again, to reemphasize what Brandon's saying, an action expresses an intent. They have a many-to-many relationship, which I think a lot of people that are new to NGRX don't quite get. There are many actions in an app, and there are many reducers, and many reducers will handle many different types of actions and vice versa. Like there's not this one-to-one relationship between an action and a reducer. The idea is that an action can be handled by multiple reducers, and a single reducer can handle multiple actions. That seem fair?
Yep.
And then they can carry any other information on them. We call this the payload of an action that has that unique type and a payload. And you should write as many of these as possible. Anything that happens that is unique in your application should get its own action.
Right, because it goes back to traceability. You know, if you get into as your application grows and you want to track down where things are coming from, you can easily use your code editor to track down an action and see where all the places that's being referenced from. And that's one big advantage of, like Mike said, using one action per site.
And it's also a lot about explicitness too, which is when you come back to work on an NGRX app after you've maybe shelled it for a couple of months, it's going to help you if you are as explicit as possible about the behavior of an application. And actions are the way that you describe these behaviors. And so because developers don't want to write too many of these, we see a lot of these action anti-patterns. And that is maybe they'll dispatch multiple actions at once. I think one of the most common questions that Brandon and I get asked is, how can I make it an effect dispatch multiple actions at the same time?
Right, and while that is something you can do, it's not necessarily the best way to do it. Because like we mentioned before, actions, you should have a single action that can be dispatched, action that dispatched from one place, so that traceability is there.
We also see developers reuse actions, and we have this rule where we work, which is to say that an action, a given action type should only be dispatched in one place in an application. There should only be one call site for an action creator in the entire app. If you're trying to reuse an action, that means you're trying to capture a new unique event, and that should get its own unique action as well.
One of the other things we've seen is embedding logic in action creators. If based on the interface we showed before, there's only the type, and if you want to add a payload, you can, but that should mainly be what you do is when you create an action is attach a type and a payload that gives some metadata, extra metadata. You don't want to, like I said, make your actions dynamic or have them call methods inside your action, because no, that's easy to do if you're using classes or even just regular functions to try to sprinkle some logic in there. But that's one of the things you should stay away from.
And so seeing these anti-patterns as the authors of NGRX, it would be easy for us to say, oh, just don't do that. But instead, what we've been doing over the past 6 months or so is instead looking at, well, what about NGRX causes developers to go down these paths? And we really do think it's about the amount of boilerplate. It is really heavy right now to write an action in an NGRX app, because it's not just adding the interface. You also have to have either a function or a class to create an instance of that action. You need to wire up the types by maybe adding it in an action union type so you can discriminate over it in a reducer. You also need to manage maybe an enum or a list of constants for the action type strings. That's how you're going to build case statements in an NGRX reducer. And so because of all of this, it's like, okay, I already have to write this many actions, and then I have to go write these reducers and effects, and it's a tremendous amount of boilerplate.
Yeah, but it's like some people just I've seen people literally or figuratively throw up their hands on Twitter like, why do I have to do so much stuff? But, you know,
so
it's part of the explicitness.
as a result, that's what we're trying to solve. Is we're trying to solve this boilerplate problem, and we have some goals that are related to this, which is don't ruin what makes ngrx awesome. Again, an ngrx app performs well and is easy to build once you get a handle of ngrx because of its explicitness. If we are to write a tool that tackles boilerplate, we really shouldn't prevent developers from being explicit.
Don't introduce magic. You know, we don't have anything specific against people building on top of ngrx, but the biggest thing we want to drive home is that make an effort to understand the pattern and not just to jump on whatever gets done, or people build things to hide those things away that don't give you a good understanding of what happens, because at some point you're going to have to rely on what you've learned using ngrx to be able to move forward with it and understand like the nuance and those subtle details that help you build things easier.
And then finally, give developers flexibility. If we're going to give you a tool to reduce boilerplate, you should be able to escape that tool at any time and do it the way that you want to do it. So if we're going to fix boilerplate, these are really the 3 themes that we're focusing on in the tools that are going to do it. So the first tool, which you can use today that I'm going to talk about, is called ngrx entity. And ngrx entity is actually a library that was created at our company. We used it for a couple of months and said, man, we could probably make this generic and bring this out and release it under the ngrx umbrella. And so what it does is it reduces boilerplate for managing model collections.
Yeah, so that's, you know, a common thing that, you know, anybody's going to do in the app is manage those collections, whether, you know, it be a collection of users or items or whatever the case may be.
Collection of heroes.
Collection of heroes would be probably a great example of that. So.
And it does that by providing a set of methods for CRUD operations. So what we saw when we were managing model collections is that, well, there's a certain number of things we always find ourselves wanting to do with this collection. We either want to get one item out of it, we want to get them all, we want to sort them, we want to know how many there are, and it's really consistent in that way. And so we provide these methods on an extendable type-safe adapter.
Right, and that adapter gives you, like we said, gives you the flexibility of, you know, some of those things out of the box. And if you want to extend it further, you can, because we provide you with a certain set of things, but then you can take it further if you need to.
So I've got some slides that kind of break out what this means, but instead I'm just going to jump right into code, I think, and show what this really means. So I've got here, let's see. If you've looked at the ngrx example code before, we have this really cool app for managing collections of books. It's not boring at all. And we have reducer. This is an example of a reducer function if you've not seen an ngrx reducer function before. So let me just break out what's going on here first, and then I'll show you how ngrx entities can simplify writing one of these. So in a reducer function file, probably one of the first things that you see at the top is a interface describing the shape of the state the reducer function manages. In this case, this is managing the collection of books. The user has the ability to select a specific book. So one of the pieces of state is which book ID is currently being selected. Because a book there can be a state where there are no books selected, it can also be null. And then IDs and entities. I'm going to come back and talk about these in just a minute. Then after you see the state declaration, there's also the initial state.
Right, and that's, you know, pretty standard practice. If you're for reducers, you take in a state and perform some operation over that state, but you need an initial state to start with. So we set some defaults for the book and the IDs and the entity like before, which is, you know, based on an ID that translates to a book.
Right. And then the last part is the reducer function. The reducer function has that signature where it takes in state and action and returns a new state. When an NGRX app first spins up, state starts as undefined. So we use a parameter initializer to say, when state's undefined, go ahead and set it to the initial state. And our initial state is no book selected, and we don't have any books loaded yet from our API or maybe local storage. And then you get sort of what people consider to be the ugly, but I think it's the beautiful part of NGRX, which is this massive switch statement with all these cases. And the first case in this reducer is when a user first loads up the app, it goes and fetches all the books in that user's collection. The user can also search, and when a search is complete, the Google Books API returns us a list of books. And so in both of these cases, we want to take the books, take the new ones that we haven't seen before in the application, and put them in our store. And so, again, I'll come back and break out what this code is doing because we're going to replace all of this in just a minute. But this is a really common example of an operation we see in NGRX apps. So there's a couple of other case statements, and then finally there are the selectors that we were talking about.
Right, and those.
Mike, Brendan.
Go ahead.
Do you guys want to just pause for a moment and talk about why? I know you're going to describe using entities and the IDs. You may want to just briefly mention what you would typically use if you weren't using that approach, what everyone else would normally use.
Sure. So yeah, this is a reducer function that does not use entity yet. And the keyword entities here is kind of misleading, but I'll go ahead and talk about why these exist and why we promote them in our documentation. And this actually isn't something we invented. This comes from the original Redux docs. But we said earlier that one of the things we see really commonly when managing a collection of models is that you either want to get one or get all of them, and you want to maybe get them all in a sorted way. And this pattern of IDs and entities allows us to do both of those operations in a way that's really, really performant.
Right, because if we see the entities, we have the unique ID, which represents a book. And if we were using something like an array for the entities, and you'd have to do a find, each time you want to go through all the items in the collection, but using an ID, we can get past the ID specifically and use a faster operation using the dictionary to get the book out of those set of entities.
Hey, when you guys have a chance, I have a couple of questions from the YouTube chat that I'm pasting into the Hangouts chat.
Okay. So yeah, this is just a common approach from Redux land, and we brought this approach over to NGRX, which is a way of setting up entity state in a way that lets you get that list quick and a single entity quick. Does that make sense, Thomas?
It does. And the thing that I was trying to point out is that until I saw this from you guys, I was defaulting to using the other approach, which was selected book ID as a property in the state, and then just an array of books, right? Yeah. And so I had to do everything just as you described. I had to do the sorting manually. I had to do searching, all of that. So by breaking it out this way is an elegant approach that I just wanted to emphasize.
Yep, it's all about performance. If you did it all in an array, you have to do an array.find to get a specific one out, and you're going to have a performance impact with that. And NGRX is really suited for high performance or performance sensitive applications. So a lot of NGRX tries to point you to doing code or NGRX in a way that is as fast as possible. So after the state interface and the initial state and that reducer function, then we have those selectors that we were just talking about that actually pull data out of this state object.
Right, and as you mentioned, Thomas, these are things that you're going to do over and over and over if you have a lot of collections of items or collections of entities or models within your app. You're going to create these selectors and maybe you copy and paste them. I don't know. That's usually the easiest way if you want things to be reusable is to do that.
And then so this reducer function, it only has 3 state transitions and only a handful of selectors, and it clocks in at 93 lines of code. So this is a small version of what we have written hundreds of times. And this is why developers feel like there's a lot of boilerplate, because this is a tremendous amount of ceremony just to manage a collection of books. And I'm not even showing the effects or the actions. Like, this is just the reducer function. So I'm going to go into import ngrx entity, and I'm going to show how all these best practices and the way that you write a reducer can be really cut down substantially by pulling in this library. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go import from ngrx entity this function called create entity adapter and an interface called entity state. So we said that this IDs entities pattern is really common and high performance, and so this entity state actually captures that. So for this interface, I can say this just extends entity state of books, and I can delete these properties, and I'm already up to 2 lines of code saved, and that's ngrx entities.
Good night. No.
The second thing that I need to do is I need to actually create what we call this state adapter. And I'm going to call this book adapter. I'm going to do create entity adapter and type it with book. And there are 2 options that I can pass into here. The first one is select ID. ngrx entity needs to know how to get that unique property that exists on the models. So I'm going to say, if I have a book, you can get the ID of the book by looking at the ID property. The second configurable option is sort compare. So what this would let you do is, if you have book A and book B, how can it sort these books? And this would be useful if you wanted to create a sortable collection of models. So what we've seen with our apps is that there are 2 ways or 2 common patterns. You either want to retain the order that the API returns your results in, or you want to sort them client side.
Right, and now what the sort compare function does is each time you, well, when we talk about it further, is when you add a model to your collection or add a group of models to your collection, and you have a sort compare, it will sort those intelligently and efficiently to make sure that they retain that same order without having to resort the entire list.
In this case, the Google Books API actually returns the books in a sorted way. So I actually want to retain the order that the API returns them in. And so I can just say, I don't need a sort compare, sort the way that I pass them to you.
And just like anything else, if you do want to have your collection sorted as they get entered into your entities, there will be a small performance hit, but that's just because of additional computing that you have to do to sort those records each time.
And then when I'm creating my initial state, since everything always has IDs and entities, I can use the book adapter, say get the initial state. I can pass in my custom property, which is the selected book ID, but then IDs and entities, it'll initialize that for me. So it's a few more lines saved. And then we get to the actual reducer function. So now that we talk about what this kind of nasty looking code does, I should have done this before I made TypeScript dislike what I've done, but that's okay. So when these actions come in, they're on the payload of the action, there's a list of books that I want to add to my state.
Right, and so like we mentioned before, those books will come in through your action payload. And like right now, the way the code is set up, we go through each book to get all the IDs, we create a set. We take the existing IDs and spread those into the array with the new IDs that we passed in. Then we create our entities from scratch, and then we return a new state that has our existing state and our new set of entities.
And we're using a set so that we only have unique IDs in the end. We're using this reduce statement to build up this object, and it's kind of nasty and unfun code to write. And rather than talk about it anymore, I'm just going to delete it and show you the entity way. So I'm going to do book adapter, add many. I'm going to pass in my books and state, and I'm done. That was a lot of lines saved.
This makes me so happy.
The next case statement, whenever a single book is loaded, like if you go to a details page for a book, we get this load action dispatched. And when you just add one and you're building the state object from it, you need to take first the original state, spread it through, and then when you're building the IDs, we want to make sure there's not, or we're not adding the book again. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make sure, okay, if I already have this book in my entities, just go ahead and return state unmodified. If I don't, put it at the end of my IDs list and go ahead and add it to my entities object. But again, we don't want to write this all the time. So all of that logic is hidden behind add one book to my state. And that's done. So we've already dramatically simplified this reducer, and we've also significantly improved the performance of it.
Right, because adding one book, and since we don't have a sorted collection, it's just going to add that existing book and its ID to the IDs array, and then we don't have to do anything else after that. And we've, like I said, saved a bunch of lines of code. You can trust that the adapter is going to be efficient about how it adds the books.
Mm-hmm. It's doing it immutably.
Right. We're still maintaining immutability, and you're still following the pattern of using reducing a new state without necessarily the magic, because we're doing something that's known. We're not hiding anything from you. It's just something that you would normally do anyway.
Right. And then if you want to write a case statement that doesn't use the adapter, just go right on ahead. Like, the adapter is just there for the case statements where you need it, and it's not something that's going to really dominate the way you write a reducer function. But there's also these selector functions. So very commonly we see select IDs and select entities, and then the selector that actually brings them all together and gets all the books. And again, I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of these because the adapter can generate these for us. And the way we do that is I can say, all right, I want to get select IDs and select entities, and I want to get a selector to get all the books. The book adapter has a method on it called get selectors, which generates these functions for us. Oops. And so we don't have to write those selector functions anymore. The book adapter knows how to interact with the state shape. And if we want to take these and compose them with other selectors, we totally can. They're just a regular selector function. And so we've taken this 94-line reducer declaration and shrunk it down to 64 lines of code. And this just saves a massive amount of time when you're writing hundreds of these.
Yep.
So if there's any questions about entities before we move on, I'm sure there are.
And I think the other point there that's important is that's protecting that immutability, right? So that we eliminated having the potential for us to have written mutations within our selector, within our reducers, and now that's squirreled away for us. So it's less opportunity for us to mess that up, right?
That's right. Everything is done in a way that is strictly immutable. Though I do recommend, if you are curious, to one day go look inside the way that these adapters are written, and there's some really interesting optimization techniques for writing immutable mutations in a way that's really fast. So it's a good resource also for learning some performance tips as well.
In fact, I wanted to comment on that. If you want to read the source code, there's an echo here. If you want to read the source code to the ngrx platform, it's really quite amazing, the kernels of insight and code tips that are in there. I have some questions on that, in fact, later. But Brandon and Mike, I wanted to point out that while you have this in your examples in the source code, and you've done a really good job of commenting, I think, the example code, having you walk through this, I had several light bulbs just go on again, right? It was just really nice having you to be able to vocalize the intent of what you were doing with, like, the adapter. So thank you very much.
Yeah. And again, like, we see this all over the place in so many ngrx apps, and that it was a really good target for saying, okay, we can take these common operations, make really generic, super fast versions of them, and just save developers time and effort. Because when you saw the original code that I replaced, it's not fun code to write. It doesn't buy you anything, and it's error-prone code, like Justin was pointing out. You can very easily mess it up in a way where you're breaking immutability guarantees or making it perform worse. So I know we have some questions. The first one comes from Val Neekman, and he asks, is there any plan to provide a native persistence of a slice of the state to local storage? Third party falls behind always. They do fall behind always. Please create an issue. If I'm sure there probably actually is one right now at this point.
Created issue before, and it's something we've looked at before. I mean, like I said, there's a library that's already maintained right now by Brian Trancone, and those are things that we always look at to see if we can do something to satisfy that area. But just as anything else, if it's something that we take on in the future, we'll see. But as of today, there's still that library. It still functions well. Of course, no library is perfect. So that's kind of where we stand with that right now.
This is Jeff's serious question because he was asking other questions. Jeff Cross wanted to know if observable is just like object.observe. And then he wanted to know if you guys could start over because he was a few minutes late. So being a troublemaker. But this was a serious question about the pain of dispatching the same action from multiple places, which is actually a really good question.
Yeah, and this is one that was a hard lesson for us to learn because, like I said at the beginning, we've been doing this for a couple of years now. And I'd say only within the past year, we've really realized how much this can bite you. And it's one of those things it's one of those costs that you don't recognize up front. So rather than, I'll give you the story that precipitated this and why we really came to believe this. So in our application, one of the ways that we get updates from our API is we get them by making REST calls, but also the API can push to us data through a WebSocket. And there was a situation where we could get all of this one type of device through a REST call, but it also give us all through the WebSocket. And what we had done is we just said, okay, we have this action type that says get all devices, and we reused it in both cases. Months and months goes by, code works great, not paying any cost for it. We've saved some time, hooray. And then we get a new requirement that basically says, okay, whenever this backend goes down, the first time you hear a WebSocket message, then you need to go ahead and display a message to the user letting them know the connection's been restored. And we said, okay, and we looked at our code, and we had done this pattern over and over again where we had reused action types. And we could no longer discern between the difference of getting this update from the backend via WebSocket versus getting the update by a successful REST completion. And so we had to pay this tremendous cost to go back and refactor all this code to distinguish between the two. And we realized at that time, man, if we just describe these with unique action types, it really wouldn't have saved us that much time. It's super easy to add case statements and reducers. Action.ofType accepts multiple action types as parameters. Like if we had just been explicit up front, this requirement, instead of forcing us to refactor a bunch of legacy code, we could have solved in a couple of hours. And so the meaning of that story really is if you're explicit up front, down the line when you have new requirements that needs you to react to special events in special ways, it's going to be way easier if you've just been consistent and used unique action types for each unique event.
And then what about the dispatching multiple actions from a single effect, and why is that an anti-pattern?
Well, one of the reasons for that is, well, besides being the unique, is that there's an issue with how those actions were processed, and dispatching multiple actions makes it harder. It basically makes it harder to diagnose an issue because those things may get processed out of order. If you have other actions that depend on those, then you're breaking that pattern of having a single action be processed and be returned back through your state, or when you're trying to, like I said, track through changes through your state. If you're dispatching multiple, like 10 actions at once, then it's kind of hard to see if you're trying to diagnose a problem, like what happened to cause that problem if you're dispatching multiple things at once. So that's one of the biggest issues I've seen before with people doing that. it gets you out of a flow that you can easily reason about. Would be the easiest way to say it.
But then also, it's kind of a symptom of that previous point where if you're using a unique action and you're only dispatching it in one single location, then why would you be in a situation where you're dispatching two actions at the same time? Like, did you just create? Like, you've probably just have written extra code when you could have captured that single event in one action and handled it consistently throughout the app.
So I have a comment and a question.
Okay.
The comment I wanted to make, because for me, this light bulb again came on this summer. And when we look at these selects, these queries, as you guys refer to them, and I refer to them as queries also, it's easy to think, okay, well, this is just a query where I'm pulling some data from our state, our data models. But the really great thing about ngrx and the subtle thing about why ngrx is important is this is not a pull. These queries are not pulls. These queries are a mechanism for pushes, for the data to be pushed to you. Right. And so for your views to respond to state changes, which I think is not only super elegant, but it's super subtle. Would you guys agree?
Definitely. And it's hard to, like, people think it's the observables that sort of buy you this performance trick that we've all heard of, which is using on-push change detection. But it's actually the selectors, because they're only going to give you a new item when state has actually changed. It's not an observable doing this, it's these selector functions. And so them returning changes in an immutable way, only when something actually changes, is what gives you that on-push change detection. If people don't quite get that it's the selector function that's doing that, it's not the observables.
Right. And then my question for you was, I think I understand how it works, but A, I'm worried I don't, so I'm going to ask the experts. And B, it gives you guys a chance to show off some of the code under the hood. When I was looking under the code, and Victor asked me this question, and it was a really tricky question that I'm not going to reveal because it's, well, there's reasons I won't reveal it. But it had to do with how do we queue operations. And inside ngrx, you have a method or an operator called observe on.
Yes. That
is hardly documented anywhere. I was talking to Bonnie about it, and she did one of these like WTF type moments, like, wait a minute, what is this? What are you talking about? And could you?
I do that a lot when you're talking, Thomas.
No. Well, I just was forwarding on some thoughts. But can you guys talk about how you use observe on and tell everyone or describe why you needed to use it and what it's useful for?
Yes. So I can probably find the call site for that pretty quickly here in the actual code. But I think this is the file. So yeah, here it is. Here's the observe on call in ngrx, and what we're doing is this is before we've gotten to the chance to refactor this code to use pipeable operators. So as library authors, before pipeable operators, you had to import the operators into .call to prevent side effects happening in your application. So that's why this is written in a weird way. But we have this actions observable, and it's the observable of all of the actions that you're dispatching in your application, wrapped up in a stream, basically. And we are using the observe on operator to observe them in a queue. So what observe on does is, underneath the hood in Rx, there are these things called schedulers. Rx is a library that does its own scheduling. And what that means is, without going too much into the details of like how the event loop works in a browser, there's a lot of code in Rx that might cause the library to maybe create a timeout or an interval, or maybe wait for the turn of the next event loop. And it doesn't want to do this aggressively. In fact, it wants to try and capture all of that as much as possible to prevent creating a ton of these intervals or a ton of these timeouts. And so underneath the hood, Rx uses these things called schedulers that allow you to take some piece of work and schedule it to happen sometime later. In this case, we're using a scheduler called the queue scheduler. And an interesting effect of observables, and one really big way in which they differ from promises, is observables are not necessarily asynchronous. You can have completely synchronous observables. And because effects allow you to subscribe to this action stream and listen for special action types. What you can do is synchronously, when someone dispatches an action, you can react to it and dispatch another action. Well, that has an interesting effect because what you would expect to happen is if an effect listens for one action type and dispatches a new one as a result, you would think that the order is the first one would hit your reducers first, and then the second one would hit your reducers. Turns out that's not the case. Because this is all happening synchronously, what would actually happen is the one your effect dispatches would hit your reducers first, and then the original one would happen. Because this is all happening synchronously at the same time, and that's really unexpected and weird behavior. So what the queue scheduler does is it says, okay, when I hit an action, do all this work, and then once that entire work has completed, move on to processing the next item. So this guarantees that the way you dispatch actions is going to be observed by ngrx in an order that you'd expect. How did I do it explaining that? Because it's a really complex, weird piece of RX.
I really like the way you talked about the fact that observables don't have to be synchronous. That's a subtle, really important issue. And if you're thinking them, asynchronous. And if you're thinking that all observables are asynchronous, that's not the case. And the cool thing about the queue is it's just one of those. You know, there's an ASAP scheduler, there's a async scheduler. And I just thought this line 31 was just a classic example of some of the kernels of really cool code that you guys have in the library.
Yep.
So thank you for describing that.
Awesome. Well, are there any other questions about entities before we move on to the next library that we're working on? Awesome. So then we'll jump right back in. Find where we were. Perfect. Okay. So entities allows you to write these entity reducers in a way that is hopefully a lot less lines of code than the way you've done it before. But there's more to the story, and that is that, well, we had to create the reducer file, and then we had to go wire up that reducer function in our providers when we're registering the store. And that's all ceremony. You're not doing anything unique typically. It's just a side effect of having to write an Angular application. So Brandon has written a library called ngrx Schematics. So I'm giving him credit.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So ngrx Schematics is, like I said, another way that we can reduce the amount of boilerplate that you have to do when you're working with ngrx, because, like I said, you have these known things that you have to create when you're using ngrx. Schematics, it's a scaffolding library for ngrx. We said, like we mentioned, actions, reducers, effects, like setting up your store. These are all common things you want to do.
And the word schematics is intentional because I don't know how much this has been talked about too much yet, but the way Angular CLI is generating code, well, that's changing. The Angular CLI team has built this tool called Schematics that allows developers to write what are called blueprints. And these are basically ways that describe how something might get generated. Is that about right?
Yes. So the blueprints, like initially back earlier in the CLI, all of this was baked into the CLI, like you said, and they took that part of it, the generating, scaffolding things you would normally want to do, and broke those out into, moved over to like the Angular dev kit. And you can take, just like you said, a set of files, and it also uses the TypeScript compiler underneath to be able to parse files or read ASTs to be able to generate these blueprints to make that process a lot easier. And as a result of that, we leveraged that work that was done through the Angular CLI team to create these blueprints for common things you would do in ngrx.
And since it's built with schematics, that means it integrates with Angular CLI. So this scaffolding library for ngrx, you invoke via the same tool you're using to generate the rest of your application and build the rest of your application.
So like you said, there's blueprints, and the blueprints are configurable. So the API is similar to what you would see if you're using Angular CLI to generate a component or a service or even a module or any other things like that to help you to get started. So you can generate the root setup for your store. You can generate a starter for your actions library. You can stub out reducers that'll give you your state interface, your initial state, and the reducer function that we mentioned before. And so that it's a way to just get you going faster if you're just starting out, or even if you're used to using it, so you don't have to do all those things from hand every time, or a copy and paste, which could be prone to errors.
It also has blueprints for effects. So it's going to generate that effects class for you, and it's going to register it in your effects module. It's got entity blueprints, so it can scaffold out parts of setting up ngrx entity, which we just demoed. It can also handle generating features. So in ngrx 4, we introduced this concept of there being features which can have their own effects and reducers. This will scaffold out an ngrx feature for you.
Right, and so the feature will, like I said, you can do these things individually: actions, reducer, and effect. And a feature groups those three things together, where it gives you an initial set of actions, reducer, and effect for a given feature, a named feature. And you can also just register that in your module, or if you have a map of reducers, it can do that also.
And then lastly, it can generate container components, which is a special kind of store-aware component. It's the component that might interact with ngrx store by dispatching actions and querying for state.
Right. So the container is more or less a component that's, like I said, pre-wired up with store already injected into it, so that you can go ahead and start using it. And so these are just to give you an overview. These are the main commands. Or the main commands that you would use to generate the blueprints for schematics. Like I said, you can generate your root state, or if you're generating a feature state, you can do that. You can provide a module, and the part at the end here is that you would specify the collection to use ngrx schematics. And one nice thing about that is this CLI will let you set a default set of schematics to use. And since we have our own schematics that we have, and then included in that are the set that you get out of the box through the Angular CLI. So if you wanted to use this as your default, you could set it to do that and not have to specify a collection each time.
So if you don't mind driving this time, Brandon, if you want to just jump into a demo and show us how these work. I've not actually seen these work. Like I said, this has been Brandon building these. Yeah,
no, it was one thing that we really want to do, just because a lot of I guess we haven't seen too many libraries of people actually building schematics. There's some in Narwhal's library, of course, that were pretty awesome, and helped guide this along. And it's just something that we could provide to the communities for people to use. Were there any questions before I get going?
There's a quick question that I just posted in. There was a question about kind of collisions among the reducers.
Okay. That was the first one we had an issue.
So Panic ST8 asked, we just had issue where property updated by a reducer triggered multiple subscriptions to different parts of the state when we only wanted one person listening to that particular object being modified. And so his question is it better to break state into smaller pieces and attach just a few reducers, or is there a better way to prevent this accidental triggering of non-updated property subscriptions? And so my question to you is, I'm going to ask you a question back. The selector should prevent this behavior from happening. What a selector function does, and why you have to create them with this create selector utility, is that it creates a memoized function, which is a way of saying if it receives the same inputs as it has in a previous call, it's not going to recompute its result. It's just going to give you the last result that it created. And so if you're using a selector function created with that create selector, and you pass that in to ngrx stores.select operator, that's going to prevent your subscriptions from firing multiple times when an unrelated piece of state changes. So I'd recommend refactoring to use selectors and the select operator if possible.
That was awesome. You guys are so cool.
Mike, Brandon, question for you. Where would we read more about features and containers?
Well, the containers is, I guess, maybe a term that's more related to the smart and presentation component pattern, which your presentational components, they don't have any knowledge of state. They won't inject store. They'll just mainly interact through inputs and outputs. Your container components are where your business logic will be, and those are usually the places that you would inject store. You dispatch actions from there. You use your selectors. So I use the word container because naming things is hard.
Yeah. So if you want to learn more about those and specific to smart and presentational components, I know Justin has a really great talk from last ngConf where he goes into a really great deep dive of this concept. So I'd start there if you want to learn about those.
It was component tranquility, if I remember that right.
It was, and I got to say, I really appreciate the fact that you're not calling them dumb components, because I really strive really hard for, like, I don't like calling anything dumb, or, you know, let's focus on the positive. So presentation, I love it.
You're such a nice person, Justin.
Yes. Okay.
You're gonna make me blush.
Okay, so we have I've created just a new Angular CLI app, and like I mentioned before, is that you can set up your collection, your schematics, to use a default collection, and by default it uses Angular schematics. And here I'm just using the ngRx schematics to extend that. And if you want to keep the default, you can still do that, and you just have to specify the collection there when you're using it. So I will go through, and as you can see in our app module here, I haven't defined anything about ngRx. I've installed the libraries, but we'll make once we get everything ready to release, we'll have complete documentation on how to use it and get set up, at least to get to this schematics installed, or the libraries that you need to use.
Yeah, that's actually an important point. ngRx Entity is released, and you can download it from NPM today. Schematics is in kind of like a soft beta, so we think they're really solid. Use them. They're not going to change too much on you, I don't think.
Now, right now, if you go to the ngRx platform repo, there's an issue there specifically for schematics for testing and feedback with more detailed instructions on installing the nightly builds, or just trying to see how it works today. If you want to try it out and give us some feedback, which would be greatly appreciated. So right now we have the collection set up, so I can do ng generate store. I'll give it a name, and I'll say root, because I want to generate the root store. And I'll say I want to update the app. It's the same thing. It uses those same CLI conventions. I want to specify the module that I want to update. And I generate the store. It tells you what it did. Created a reducers file and an index, and updated my app module. And now you can see through schematics. You can see here it imported things that I need. Store module. It created my reducers file, and it exports a set of reducers, an empty object of reducers. Any meta reducers, if I have any. It wires up store dev tools and sets up the store dependencies here without me, having to go through the docs, or normally things you'd have to copy and paste, or however you need to do to get set up.
And it doesn't get all with best practices. We're not configuring the reducers here. We're exporting them from the right place. It's using the best practice for setting up store dev tools conditionally, so that it's on in development but off in production. And so we're giving you best practice generation kind of out of the box with this tool.
Right. So I'll go and look at the reducers file next. And as you can see, like I said, it's scaffolded out based on the things that you would normally need in your reducers file: your action reducer map, your state that you want to set up, and your reducers and any meta reducers if you choose to use those. And those are common things like logging, or meta reducers like logging out all the actions that you've passed through the state. Or if you use something like store freeze to make sure you maintain that immutability,
right?
To make sure that you aren't like accidentally muting your state, not intentionally, but accidentally. Those would be where you would register those. So that was just an example of generating the root store. I can also generate an effect for the roots and say app module. And if I type that correctly, oh, I forgot a name. And we'll call it user. And so it created, like I said, it's scaffolding. So those things that you would normally do, it created user effects, already injects actions, even injects a test file to test your effects, and updates your app module or whatever module you provide to register that. So it eliminates some of that boilerplate that you would normally, like I said, normally have to type in to register effects in the root or in a feature module. And this is not just, you know, for the root application. If I went through and created another like a feature module, and I wanted to give that feature a new, give that feature its own state, I could do that also using a generate command. And as I mentioned before, as we talked about before, you can generate a feature, which is a combination of those three things. I can generate feature. I can call this items. And another, we generate items, and provide a module. Everything correctly. And I'm not going to create any additional folders because we're just showing you how it works here, but it will register it there. Generate feature. And as you can see here, we have items.actions, reducers, test, effects, and it updates the app module. We can see here there's store module for feature, items for that piece of state, and register these effects. And as you can see, as you're going through and generating new areas of your app, it automatically creates an enum of action types, gives you an action, default action just to start with, and gives you that union type that you can use in your reducer. When you create a feature, everything's already wired up for the actions that were created. You take in your initial state is set up and returns a new state. And that's here for a feature. And as I'll go through and create one more, which is an entity.
Hey, Brandon.
Sure.
What is that for feature in the module itself?
Sure.
Can you describe that a little bit? Because it continues to confuse me.
So in an Angular app, the Angular router makes it really easy to lazy load in components. And it turns out that when you lazy load in, you're not just lazy loading in components, it actually says you're loading in an entire module, an entire Angular module. And these Angular modules might want to bring their own global state and their own effects to run. And so we put them in the root module just for demonstration purposes. But the intent is that you use for feature in your lazy loaded Angular modules. And that's going to dynamically register those new reducer functions and those effects when that code gets loaded into the application.
Perfect. Thank you.
So if I generate a new module, I can generate new module and create an admin folder. And let's say I wanted to add a piece of state to that admin module that loads, like you said, as a feature. I could do ng generate again, admin, and give it that piece of state a name, user. And I type this correctly. If I'm making mistakes, I apologize in advance. So I'm gonna generate a reducer. Admin that goes into the admin folder, creates a user reducer and registers it with the admin module. Specify module doesn't exist. So I've created an admin, a user reducer under admin, and normally you would, you create this under like a reducers folder that you'd have your user reducer under the admin module. So like I stated, now that we have admin module, and we have store for feature, and we have the user feature slice that could be registered. If the admin module was loaded in lazily, that feature state would get loaded in when that admin module is loaded in, as opposed to being eagerly loaded with all the rest of your modules out of the box, or how you would normally load in your modules.
And so this builds into the theme of our philosophy of like, let's just generate the parts that you don't want to write yourself, that aren't inherent to your application logic. Instead, we're just focusing on the ceremony, the things you're doing over and over again that aren't really going to change between your applications.
All right. So, are there any other?
So I have a question. This may be too technical, and if it is, please tell me to take it offline.
Yeah.
What did you guys encounter when you were creating the store module for feature under the hood? Did you encounter any issues on how to support the lazy loading aspects that were sort of tricky?
Yes. So I'll give you like a real quick overview of ngrx is based on this library called Redux in React land. And in traditional Redux, you only have one reducer function, and it's created by using this utility called combine reducers. And there's some ceremony there, but the idea is you only have one reducer function. In order for ngrx to support this for feature, we had to break that convention. So it's really the first time that ngrx deviated in a meaningful way from Redux, and that we had to re-implement this concept, but do it in a way that had multiple reducer functions that can change over time. And we went around and around on this, and then one day just sort of dawned on us as a group, well, wait, why can't we just express your reducer functions as an observable? So if you go look into how this is done behind the scenes, there's an observable of your reducer functions, and that can change over time as new code gets loaded in, and it's all handled the way you'd expect. It's with just traditional RX operators, and it was a really big breakthrough for us in how to build this in a clean way.
Yeah, I would say prior to version 4, that was probably the #1 wanted to do, because you could do it in version 2, but you had to take your existing reducers and combine them with the reducers that you had when you loaded a new feature, and kind of replace the reducer that was there. And introducing that in version 4 made that process a lot more easier and a lot more natural to do. Because like you said, you lazy load features using the router, so naturally you want to lazy load your state there and not have everything loaded up front.
So when that observable emits, then you just call combine reducer again?
Yeah, that's basically the way it works.
Sweet, thank you.
Bill Odom asked, is there an official style guide or an updated best practices doc for ngrx platform?
Bill Odom stole my question, by the way.
I'm sure Brandon and I would both love that resource existed, but that's not a trivial resource to put together. Instead, we really lean on the example app as being like okay, go look at this. This is how you do it. The one flaw of that, and I think we've done a lot of work to improve it, is that the example app for a long time wasn't structured like a real Angular app might be structured. And so we're improving that piece of it all the time. But yeah, the example app really stands as our sort of living style guide.
Right. And to complement that, like Thomas mentioned earlier, the example app, it has comments in there that talk about the specific practices or different ways that we do things, or different ways that things are done there to kind of break down what we do and like kind of demystify the decisions that are made, or even along with the documentation. Like, I really try to make the documentation as straightforward as possible, so that new people coming to it aren't driven away at least by that. So they can at least start there, and if you want to dive into the example, or even dive into the source to get a better understanding of it, we try to make those things easily approachable.
And I would think, although it won't cover everything that a full style guide would cover, I would think that the schematics with the CLI would introduce some standards that would help people get used to a good approach to take for these things.
Right, because one of the things that we probably recently switched to was using enums for action types as opposed to using constants, because of course practices change, best practice change over time. You get new information. You want to do things the standard way. So, like I said, yeah, schematics will at least give you a baseline of what we consider the practice you should use if you're generating an effect or an action. This would be a good starting point for you.
Yep.
And Victor Sapkin was on, Justin had him on Angular Air a couple weeks ago talking about the NX. Victor Sapkin is very opinionated when it comes to stuff like that. So I think that would also be another really good resource, that episode. I don't remember which episode that was, but it was pretty recent on Angular Air, so that might be another good resource.
Yep.
And then, I think, I don't know how Brandon breathes when with how much Victor and I suffocate him with our opinions, because I am just as strongly opinionated. And we do clash at times, but it's fun.
So how do you guys resolve that? Do you like arm wrestle at some point? Rock, paper, scissors?
No, we just don't talk about it and we let it seethe. We have a pretty collaborative experience with him. We chat pretty frequently, and the one thing that we're talking about this before the show, where people can have different opinions about how much to use ngrx. We have different opinions on certain best practices, and they're both really valid, and they have really good arguments for why you might want to choose one or the other. And so we just focus on the technical reasons and hopefully give developers enough information to pick the right path to go, because it is a complex topic with a lot of right answers.
I had a hard time when I first met Victor, because he has an accent, and he would talk so fast and on such a high level. Like, it was hard to keep up with him. But now that I've known him for a while and I've gotten used to him, he's hilarious. Like, he's so funny. I didn't realize in the beginning that he was funny until I got to know him a little bit better, but he's so funny.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So my ears perked up when you said enums. I had not seen in the code that you had made that change, and so I just took a look at the diff, and it looks pretty interesting. I come personally from the Java world, and I love Java-style enums, and so I've always wanted there to be a full enum type that was a class, and felt like if I could have all my actions defined as a set of enums in the Java style, where I could have that, it would be better. And I actually created my own library that I did that. I wonder if it comes to the type of thing you had mentioned at the beginning, where that would be something you would recommend away from, because it might be hiding some of the issues. But personally, I've had a lot of success with building my own enum construct to hide the boilerplate of actions. But I think it'll be interesting to combine that with entities and remove even more.
Yeah, I'm actually now connecting the dots, because I did not realize I've actually seen that library before, and I'm familiar with it because Rob, who's on the ngrx team, is also a really big fan of it, and so we talk about it a good deal. And I don't think it does have a little bit of magic to it, but the thing that I like is I'm always a big fan of any library that makes it easier to write really type strong code. And I hope that, like, the reason we added string enums into the best practices for ngrx is because the TypeScript language added support for them. So I'm hopeful that some of the things you're doing in your library make its way into the language, so that we can write those types of actions in a more elegant way. That makes sense?
Yeah, that's cool. I'm glad to hear that you have heard of it. Maybe at ngConf or something like that, we can chat and
Definitely. Be awesome.
Combine ideas.
Yep.
I know we're running out of time, but I posted a few more questions. We have a really good question from Mike Moreland, who's a friend, our Beast Code friend. And then I have another, I know we're running low on time and you guys have to go because you've been working all day, but there's another question from Panic State, if you have time.
Yes, there's also a question from Val Niekman. He asked, what if we didn't have any reducers, effect, and root, but only in features? Real simple. You still have to do the for root, but just use an empty object or an empty array. Empty object for your reducers, empty array for your effects. Okay. And then Michael Moreland asks, is your lazy loading an email module that contains an action to create a new email? How do best share those actions with other modules before it's loaded? That is a really good question. And I don't think that's something we have a good demo of in the example app, but it's something that happens in our application all the time. And that's all of our feature modules. You see it pretty commonly where they have this like /shared folder. We have a /actions folder. And the code for actions, there's really not that much code to it. It compresses really small, and so it's okay if that's bundled in your main bundle. It really is just like some interfaces and strings. And so we have no problem sharing action types throughout the entire application. Just know that it won't lazy load those string constants. But again, I don't think it's a big deal. It's going to be really small to your bundle size.
Do you share action creators or just action types?
Just action types.
Okay.
Yeah, an action creator should probably only be consumed by the feature that's loading it in.
So I have one question as well before we go. Have you ever considered doing like a connect decorator, like in React, for example, where we can, because what I really don't like when I'm using a lot of stuff like selectors in my code, that I always have to write the async pipe every time. So basically what I even try to do is just make a decorator that actually does the same thing, but in on my component. So basically when it on ngDestroy, it unsubscribes. So is there going to be like an official like decorator, something like that? Or
so that's one of the things where we rely on our connection with Rob to solve, because I think that's a framework problem, an Angular framework problem. And I don't want to, like, to write a connect decorator, we have to circumvent dependency injection. I don't want to get into that business. But if you listen to some of the talks that Rob's been giving recently about the new component stuff that he's working on, the web component stuff, he's starting to talk a little bit about this idea of what does an Angular look like without zones, and if you just had observables everywhere. And then maybe you're seeing that all of your property bindings and all of your templates are observable sources and not. So you can see that the Angular team might be going that direction, and we are big proponents of that, but we'd want to see the Angular team do it and not us.
yeah, because I talked to him actually on Angular Connect, and I just wanted to hear your opinion about it. Yeah. And one other interesting thing that came on one of our meetups here was actually using Redux versus Apollo cache. Are you familiar with Angular Apollo and like the GraphQL? So basically the cache, what it does is that it caches the queries and then actually normalizes all the queries. So basically you cannot you can eliminate Redux from your application if you're using Apollo cache, for example. So it's really interesting just to think about it.
Yeah, and it's a similar problem with Firebase. Like if you're using Firebase, you've already got this reactive store. Like why do you need ngrx or Redux? And we're aware of that interesting.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. Yeah. And just for a lot of people who are actually starting to use Redux, I always tell them don't put all the things inside the store, because sometimes when they start using it and they decide that they have to put everything inside, all the state, but something that is important, that if you want to persist state, you should always use, not always, but sometimes use the URL for persisting state.
Right. With anything, I would say with anything else, you know, it's a decision that you have to make on a case-by-case basis. Some things are, you know, if some things are easily you can put those in the store because you need to share those across multiple places. But there are some things that not everything needs to go in the store, and you know, that's just the way it is. Trying to make that decision on what goes in and what's not, it just depends on what your needs for that data is.
I have a comment. It was related to something Victor told me or taught me a couple weeks ago. When you're using ngrx, obviously you're using observables. And the great thing about using presentation components is using observables, you can use the async pipe. So you don't have to worry about extracting the data out of the async pipe. And one of the things that Victor mentioned to me, and it was, again, a light bulb that went on, he goes, you don't need to use the async pipe in your presentation component. You can actually use it outside of the presentation component as part of the input to extract the data, and then you're giving raw data right into your presentation components.
Right.
And they don't have to worry about async pipes and observables or any of that mess. And it just fits in so beautifully with ngrx again. So it's just, I love to see how patterns build upon themselves.
Right.
Definitely a good point.
So there's another question from Panic ST8. We were using DevTools to dump state to the database when user error occurred. However, it got so slow we had to turn off DevTools until needed. Is there a way to dump journal history without enabling the DevTools? And they'd like to turn the DevTools back on. Yeah, so DevTools performance is something that we're super, super keenly aware of how bad it is. And what it comes down to is right now we have this like extension and we have to clone the state and send it over this Chrome extension API. Terribly slow. We have ideas on how to fix that and we want to get it right. The concern that we have is to do it, we think we'd have to make our own Chrome extension instead of playing with the Redux extension. And so we want to be very intentional about that decision if we do end up going down that road. The DevTools performance is something we're aware of and plan to fix.
Speaking of, I know we're out of time because you guys said you had a hard stop at 8 o'clock, and I want to respect that. But I don't want you guys to go because we could talk to you guys all night, and we would be totally happy with that. You come back every week, and we'll just do this show and ask you more questions because this is really cool, and this makes me very happy. But I did want to mention that you guys actually, if you love ngrx as much as we do, you can actually back them. You can go and contribute just a couple dollars a month. I actually just did it during the show because I was so excited about all the cool stuff you guys have been doing. So if you want to contribute, you can go to the GitHub. You can obviously contribute by opening PRs and helping out, helping with the docs because these guys are doing a lot of work. And I think even if you're really new to open source and you're just not confident enough, you want to help, but you just don't feel like you can probably help out with docs. And if you just don't feel like you're advanced enough to contribute at all, you can contribute by being a backer and just pledge a couple dollars a month, and that will encourage them to keep writing more code for us.
Yes.
Yeah, most definitely. We're something we're trying to be aware of is like issues, like you said, people may be like intimidated by the code base, but some things we go through and we actually say, you know, we can, if somebody proposes something, you know, we'll put, you know, label on it. GitHub has been pushing that lately about things that you can accept PRs for, to kind of lower that barrier to say, hey, you know, come contribute to this thing. And, you know, because we're all, you know, we're still all learning together, and we want to share that knowledge with other people. So definitely, like I said, you can go through the Open Collective site, documentation, but, you know, if you see something or, you know, that you want to submit a PR for, I mean, feel free. Or we have things, you know, that people can't submit PRs for.
So
well, I think I speak for all of us when I say we love you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I know it's 8 o'clock and our time is up, but it makes me sad because I don't want to say goodbye to you guys, but y'all are awesome. And it goes without saying, you guys are welcome back anytime. Please come back anytime you want because I really love having you guys on. I'm like cool by association just by having you guys on my show. So. and I want to say thank you for the panel. We lost Keith. I know we've been on for a while, but thanks Ilya, thanks Justin and Lance and Thomas. And
Bonnie,
yeah.
before you go,
yeah,
you should tell everyone if you come to ngConf, make sure you track down Brandon and Mike and tell them how much you like the ngrx in person. Buy them a beer.
No, okay. You don't have to buy some beer. Definitely come talk to us because in every NG Conf, that's the thing. Like we've stopped going to the talks for the most part because just hearing from developers.
You can't say that.
We wish we could do both, but in terms of value,
that's my favorite part right there. You can't say that.
But, come talk to us because it was extremely helpful in deciding where we were going to take the library over this past year. That is a big reason why we introduced the 4 feature stuff. It's why we're reducing boilerplate. Like your feedback drives NGRX probably way more than you'd imagine. So come talk to us.
Very cool.
And don't be intimidated. You don't have to be an expert to talk to them. You just have to be nice. That's all. That's the only requirement. Just be nice. You don't have to be like, you know, because it's intimidating sometimes to talk to you guys. Not you guys, just like all the core contributors. It's intimidating, but don't be intimidated. Just come and talk to them. And
come see us.
Well, thank you all so much. Thanks, Mike and Brandon and the panel, you guys. This was such a cool show.
That was really good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye.